Hey everybody, Honest Dad here. We're at the soccer field watching our son do soccer and apparently using a communal word to describe ourselves because that's what happens when you're a dad and you don't get enough sleep. But it's all good. So anyway, I am at the soccer park. Wanted to take some time here to go ahead and talk about the state of the Chinese economy and to answer specifically, is it a Ponzi scheme? So whenever you talk about the Ponzi scheme, you're talking about an advanced MLM or multi-level marketing, which is a system that exists outside of the traditional rules of supply and demand, with those being the basically harmonization of supply, demand, and labor. And everyone forgets about labor, and we'll get into that later, but it is an important component of a free market system. So in a true free market, markets are created to meet demand, supply is produced to meet demand, and labor establishes an equilibrium between those 2 points, and you have mass prosperity. But in a multi-level marketing system, in a Ponzi scheme, essentially what they try to do is they try to rig the system of demand. And how they do that is by a massive supply side effort. So the original Ponzi scheme was essentially this guy, his name was Ponzi. He was an Italian immigrant, moved to New York, and he had this idea of basically creating a shipping company that shipped all kinds of things, mainly letters back from the United States to Europe, because immigrants like to send lots of letters home. But instead of creating an efficient system to collect and deliver the letters that made him money, that met the demand, and met the needs of labor and supply, essentially he just created an investment pyramid, whereby he got people to invest in his company, which allowed him to expand, which then allowed him to get more investors to invest in his company, which allowed him to expand again, and so forth and so on. But along these expansions, he had no means of actually scaling up his company to meet actual demand. The real demand to send letters back to Europe at this time didn't even approach his capacity to send them back. But he just kept building rung after rung, rung after rung. When investors wanted out, when investors wanted to cash out or sell their stock, he would then just use the money that new investors were putting in to pay those people out. Well, anyone with a brain can determine how this is eventually going to just collapse. The people at the top are going to make out with lots of money, and eventually someone at the bottom, usually the latecomers, are going to hold the bag. Now, we certainly live in a time when this sort of thing is very much trumpeted. The entire state of Utah embraces MLMs because the scale of everything is so high. But if you actually had an economy of all MLMs and Ponzi schemes, the entire economy would collapse and we'd have a communist state very quickly because you evaporate any kind of market confidence. Anyway, so that's what a Ponzi scheme is. Now let's answer the second question: is China a Ponzi scheme? So what I want to talk about really fast is the parts of the Chinese economy that no one really talks about, that don't make it to the news, that don't even make it into the books anymore because the books are very highly censored. And that is the rules that operate within the Chinese economy if you are a Chinese businessman or businesswoman trying to open up a company and succeed in China. Now, everyone is blinded by all these growth numbers, but let's get into it. So in China, it is a law that all of the land is owned by the state. So every centimeter of land, every acre of land, everywhere is owned by the state. This ownership continues post-sale. So if you buy a factory or a condo or a mansion in China, even though you own the land, the Communist Party, the government still owns the land. So they can escheat it, which basically means they can just take it from you whenever they want legally. There's no debate about that in Chinese law. Now, how does this affect the economy? Well, let's say you are building a factory or a mall or an apartment complex in China to meet the demand for people needing apartments or meet the demand for, let's say, soccer balls that are used extensively in the United States. Well, you are first going to need land. So how do you get that land? Is you have to go to the Chinese Communist Party and you have to get approval to have that land. Now, there's middlemen and intermediaries and all this, but in the end, the state decides whether or not you get the land. In exchange for that land, you basically have to sign a promise, and that promise is that up to 80% of your corporate profits and your personal wealth, if you become a billionaire, has to be deposited into state-run banks. It cannot be loaned out over the counter. It cannot be converted into hard currency, foreign hard currency, and it certainly can't be invested abroad unless the government specifically allows you to do that. It has to be invested back into the Chinese economy. So that's the deal you have to sign to even get the land to build anything. So that's the first part, and please remember that. The second part is the financing itself. So as I said, all the land in China is owned by the state. Well, so is all the financial infrastructure, all the banks, the stock market exchanges, the market makers, the trading companies are all technically owned by the Chinese state. And this is not a partial ownership, this is a full ownership. They might assign shares out to people, but they're revocable shares. So even the billionaire that runs the bank, okay, even the CEO of the bank can have all of his shares, escheated, removed, and returned to the state pot. Now, how does this affect the loaning of money? So in a free market system, investors and banks theoretically are going to invest in companies based on the potential merit of those companies to meet a demand. In China, the government basically says, okay, well, we gave you the land and we will find a way of giving you financing. We will loan you the money to build this company. Again, if you commit to this system of depositing that money back into the state-owned bank. But here's the catch. Where does that money come from that they're loaning back out? It comes from the earlier investors that were given free land to build a factory or an apartment complex, and that then deposited that money back into the bank. So where did they get that in the first place? The bank, the government. So the government is basically loaning money to person A, okay, and loaning money and land to person A, who then deposits profits from that transaction back into the state pot. They use those profits to then fund the business ventures of person B, and then the profits of person B to fund the business ventures of person C, and so forth and so on. Now that is, pretty close to the definition of a Ponzi scheme. But there's another level of this. So the internalized system of land sale and financing is very rigged, but so is the actual demand chain. Now China produces a whole lot of demand, meets a bunch of demand, produces a whole lot of products, all over the world. Industrial tools, manufacturing, soccer balls, shirts, everything, right? They're the manufacturing capital of the universe. But, okay, all of that is, again, state controlled. So the state is like, hey, we see that there's a market in the United States we think we can dominate. That's the soccer ball market. So we're going to build a factory on loan land, on profits, taken from our banks, from other people. And we're going to have you, the investor, build a soccer ball factory. And in the Chinese system, what they do is they'll find like 10 or 15 or 20 different entrepreneurs, and they'll say, okay, you are basically our soccer ball people. All of you create a business, create a company, create a business model, create a supply chain, and we will give you free land and we will give you free money, essentially to produce these soccer balls, right? And whichever one of you, it's like super Darwinian right here, whichever one of these 20 people survive is actually going to dominate that industry. All the other maybe 15 or 16 companies that are created and fail, no worries, just the cost of doing business. Now, the reason they do this is essentially to astroturf or to bootstrap innovation. I mean, if you have 20, let's say you have a total of 25 people wanting to create a soccer ball business in China and to send those soccer balls to the United States. In a free market system, maybe only one or two of them would get funding. In a free market, usually that would be one that is merit-based and one based on cronyism. But there's still some merit in there. In the Chinese system, literally everyone that walks in the door gets funding. And their hope is that by doing this, you are actually going to you're going to get the one or two entrepreneurs that are going to get it right, that are actually going to succeed in dominating this industry and taking this market share from somebody else. And they're basically right, at least in the short term. Longer term, that will end up just creating a massive bubble, and innovators from around the world will beat them. But in the short term, that's going to work. So we have three levels of a Ponzi scheme. The land system of land acquisition is a Ponzi scheme. The system of financial acquisition is a Ponzi scheme. And the system of acquiring demand is a Ponzi scheme. But there is one more component, okay? That is labor. So everything in China has to be built, right? Everything has to be moved, built, a lot of heavy manual labor. It's people, all right? And again, in a free market system, labor has value. As a worker, as an average person, as a peasant, your only weapon, your only ability to navigate a free market system is the value of your labor. That's your time and that's your expertise. So in a free market system, okay, there is some level of a competitive hiring environment. Indeed, the whole way that the freaking capitalist system developed in the first place was in Europe, in the late Middle Ages. It had to heavily do with the competitive nature of labor and labor in guilds, as well as even peasant labor, becoming highly competitive and requiring merchants and landowners to compete for this labor. So this is what's not going on in China. In the United States, if you're a really skilled laborer at a profession, let's say you're a great welder, you can leverage that to have better wages, better benefits, move around companies. Well, not in China. China's entire industrial economic system is based on a massive flow of between 250 and 500 million migrant workers that come from rural China. These are Chinese migrant workers inside China to work in the factories. A lot of them come from one of China's 40 sub-ethnic groups like the Shan or the Uyghurs, Mongols, Tibetans, etc. These people are essentially forced to do this. They're forced to do this because the government controls all the land, so they can kick them off their land if the government wants to. The government also has a massive terror state and infrastructure in the form of the People's Liberation Army and the massive Chinese surveillance state that can be deployed at any time to go after any community that is not following this economic pattern. These people are given free train pass, and they are given rental subsidies to basically migrate from rural China to coastal China to work in these factories. In exchange for that, the government essentially ensures a subprime labor pay rate for these people. So if, say, the pay should be $25 a day for a worker in China, the government essentially guarantees that's going to be $10. And the workers have no rights. They have no ability to unionize. Large groups in China are still broken up extremely quickly because the government is afraid that they're going to lead to larger revolts. That's a valid fear. Almost every Chinese dynasty has fallen that way, which is basically angry peasants, angry rural workers getting together and building a mob that becomes a bigger mob, that overthrows the state. And this is what's being rigged, right? The entire system of labor is being rigged. So that's what we kind of have, is we kind of have a massive MLM or a massive Ponzi scheme in China, where the financing, the land acquisition, the demand acquisition, and the labor are all rigged and controlled by who? By the state, by the people at the top. Now, how would it fall? How would it collapse? That's a very interesting question. So we live in such a global economy that this kind of system could and will endure for quite some time, especially since a lot of foreign companies have been tricked into thinking that China is an economic miracle, and then they pump resources into that system. When in reality, if you look under the hood, the Chinese miracle is not as great as it seems. It's much more of a Gilded Age. There's massive wealth disparities in rural and coastal China. I'll be doing a whole separate video on this. Education disparities. There's whole apartment blocks that are empty, whole apartment complexes that are empty because the government insists that these companies keep buying and building real estate so that the real estate bubble doesn't implode. But how does this all implode? Well, it would implode in two ways. If there ever was a serious war with China, the Chinese economy would collapse within 4 or 5 months. And the reason for that is without that outflow of produced goods and the inflow of foreign capital from either investment or from just sales and trade, the Chinese economy would falter and collapse within a matter of 3 or 4 months. They would stabilize it for a while, but eventually would collapse, especially if there's the demands of a war going on. And the reason for that is that China does not have a market internally for its own products. Since it's been rigged, and since it's been rigged primarily to export industrial goods like soccer balls that the Chinese don't usually use or use in mass, an interruption in that supply chain would destroy China. Since the economy has not evolved in any reasonable way that is accurate to the real demand in China, you would have a massive economic collapse in the face of a war. You could also add massive global natural disaster, alien invasion, zombies, angry birds, anything that disrupts that global supply chain and that constant outflow. The second way it would collapse is more traditional, which is that eventually China will tax its rural population so much and put so many burdens on them that population will either revolt or the environment of rural China will collapse because there's not enough people to maintain it. There's not enough people to maintain the rural infrastructure. And the government is pumping too much pollution into the rural areas. And eventually the biosphere would just collapse, lead to large-scale crop failures, starvation, and a domino effect that would destroy the country. There are other real high finance ways that this could go down. But the point is that it's going to take a major shock. But if the Chinese economy gets that major shock, it's gone. Right? Max 6 months, because it's just not structured to survive on its own. Now, the United States, Europe, do they have massive, widespread systemic economic problems? Absolutely. But there's still enough left of a true free market in both of those areas that the economy has evolved in a way that does service domestic demand and does service the actual realities of the free market enough that a massive shock would hurt. It would hurt massively, but it wouldn't destroy the economy altogether. Thanks, guys.